Welcome everyone, Crazy here, and today I want to talk about some original chapters that I would love to see added into Dead by Daylight. First, I'm going to start off with some original chapters that are actually based off of existing lore in Dead by Daylight, because I think these would be the most likely ones to be added into the game. Starting off first here, we have the casting of Frank Stone. I would love to see this as an actual chapter in the game. If you don't know, the casting of Frank Stone is a upcoming game made by Supermassive Games, the same people that made Until Dawn, and it's going to be a story choice based game. Here on the screen you can see these are some of the characters we already know about. At the top we have Frank Stone, who is supposedly the killer of this game, and below we have some potential survivors that could be important characters to the story. I think it'd be really cool to see this as a chapter in the game, especially because there's going to be a lot of hype around the game and a lot of people curious about these characters. So I think it'd be cool to have these characters release around the same time as the game. Of course, Frank Stone would be the killer for this chapter. There would be a possibility that they would just make Frank Stone a legendary skin for the Trapper because he has a lot of similarities to him. However, I would like to see him as his very own killer with a different power. Sadly, because the game's not out yet, I can't really speculate what his power would be because we don't know too much about him yet. And of course, for the survivor of this chapter, it would be whichever character would be considered the main character. Obviously, in these choice-based games, you usually switch between characters often, so it's kind of hard to determine which character would be the main character of the game. However, there's typically at least a few of them that have a bigger spotlight than the others. Moving on to yet another killer that we already know about in the Dead by Daylight lore, and that is a spider killer. We actually saw this in the Tome lore, in this cutscene that you see on the screen. This is a killer I would otherwise say would not be very likely because of how difficult it would be to be added into the game. However, recently we've seen Dead by Daylight adding a lot of non-human creatures into the game, especially having creatures that crawl like the Xenomorph. So I think a spider killer would actually be very possible for them. I'd love to see a power based around spider webs. There's a lot they can do with that, but a couple examples I have would be to shoot a spider web at the survivor during a chase, and it would allow you to slow the survivor down so you can catch up quicker. Or even have it so you have to shoot them multiple times, and once you hit a certain threshold, maybe have the survivor stuck in place and have them have to wiggle free. Obviously, I'm not amazing at bouncing and stuff, but I think something along the lines of a power like that would be really cool to see in the game. Moving on to yet another chapter idea, in the Dead by Daylight lore, it's actually proven that there's alternate universes where the survivors and killers turned out differently because they are from another universe entirely. An example of this is we see a version of Yui, which actually is a killer. In the Tome lore, we see her kill somebody, and I think it would be really cool if they had actually a couple of chapters like this, where we see versions of survivors turn into killers and the killer counterparts turn into survivors. Of course, they could just make these legendary skins, which would still be very cool. However, I think it would be even cooler to see their own take on that killer's power. Another original chapter I'd like to see in the game would be Dracula or Vampire. We see in the Tome lore that there is this kind of version of Dracula here, and I think it'd be really cool as a killer. The only thing that could stop this from happening is at the moment there is some leaks going around that do claim that Dracula from the Castlevania series is being added into the game. However, these very well could turn out to be untrue. So because of that, I think the next best thing would be to have Behavior's own interpretation of a Dracula or vampire killer. Next up we have Saku from the Tome lore. I think it'd be really cool to have a samurai survivor in the game, and I think it could allow for some very interesting perks and also different cosmetics because of her time period. I'd also really love to see the Observer added into the game as a survivor. If you don't know, the Observer is the person from the Tome lore. He's kind of who narrates all of the lore. And I think because of that, Maybe he could narrate the matches as you're playing, because we have seen many survivors have their own voice lines in the game recently. Of course, they would have to add a lore reason for this for it to make sense, but I think there's definitely ways they can get around it, especially because at the moment there's a lot of mysterious stuff going on with the Observer in the Tome lore. Now that I've mentioned some original characters I'd love to see in the game that are from Dead by Daylight's lore, I now want to mention some characters that are actually from real-life folklore. A werewolf would be one of my dream killers to have in Dead by Daylight, and for the power, there's a lot of different possibilities. Of course, in the beast form, I think they should have a heightened speed, or at least an ability that increases speed, and there should definitely be some kind of pounce or claw attack. I also think it'd be cool to have the idea of them being able to transform into a survivor in order to mess with the survivors' heads in the match. I know the idea of a transforming killer has been discussed very often in the Dead by Daylight community, and I do understand that for people that are grouped up, it wouldn't have as big of an effect. However, I do still think it could cause some confusion and still be cool for a killer ability, especially if their actual ability is very strong regardless. Another one of my dream killers to have in Dead by Daylight would be Moth Man, or really any flying cryptid. We do know that the Unknown is actually Dead by Daylight's own version of a cryptid, which is very cool. However, he is obviously very different in design to something like Mothman or the Jersey Devil. I know adding a flying killer is a very bold statement, and Behaviors actually said before that they had problems with a flying killer they wanted to add into the game, but I do actually have a video where I explain how this can actually work out in a different way. And to basically sum it up, if you don't want to watch that full video there, I think it should just allow them to float over pallets and windows. That way they're not kind of flying super high in the air, but it still is a unique ability that other killers do not have. Obviously, because this is an original chapter, they would probably do their own take on a Mothman, but just some kind of flying, creepy, cryptid creature would be really cool to see in the game. Another original killer I would love to see in the game would be a killer based around Eldritch Cosmic Horror. If you don't know, this is kind of stuff like H.P. Lovecraft and Cthulhu and stuff like that. However, I wouldn't want to see Cthulhu in the game. I would like to see Behavior's own approach to this and have a super unique design just based around those kind of concepts and principles. There's a lot of creepy things you can do with Eldritch Horror, and I think Behavior's take on that would be super cool and creepy, especially because we've been seeing a lot of non-human killers added into the game, like the Unknown. As for the power, I don't really have much ideas because this would just be an original concept that would be kind of out of the box. But of course we can have things centered around tentacles and stuff like that that are very akin to Eldritch Horror. Moving on, I'd also really love to see a Gargoyle Killer. Of course this would be Behavior's own interpretation of a gargoyle, so it wouldn't look exactly like this. But something along the lines of this would be really cool to see. Especially to have an ability based around gargoyle statues. Maybe these spawn randomly across the map, and they can either be a transportation point, or allow you to kind of camp on one of them and scout out an area and then kind of scare a survivor in that way. I think it'd be very cool. Also, of course, because it does have wings, you could maybe use the flying concept from the Mothman killer I had. You can do a lot of different things with this, but I think it'd be very cool to have something along the lines of this in the game. This is yet another vague killer idea, but it would be a Banshee. I think the Banshee would definitely be unique because of their screaming ability. I'm not sure exactly how this should work in Dead by Daylight, but maybe something along the lines where if you scream at a survivor, it kind of disorients them, so it's harder for them to see and know where they're going. Of course, yet again, I am not great at balancing and stuff, so they could always mix this up, but something along the lines of a power like that would be pretty cool to see in the game. And lastly, I'd like to see some kind of swamp monster added into the game. I know the Hag already is basically a swamp monster, and she even has a skin where she looks more amphibian, but I think a killer with a power centered around that would be even cooler to see in the game. The power would be very hard to add into the game because obviously you cannot add water to the existing maps of Dead by Daylight because they're very flat and aren't really made to have water added to them. Because of this, I have an idea where possibly you can have a power similar to Cage of Torment when you down a survivor, but instead of sending them to a cage, maybe send them to like a big vast ocean where you can attack them in the ocean and kind of swim around. This would be very different from any other killer in the game, but we do see Dead by Daylight is kind of open to doing, different powers for killers. For example, the Xenomorph added vents into the game with a whole underground system, so I don't think it's too out of the box to have a little mini underwater level where you can kind of send survivors to when you down them. Of course, there would have to be a lot of different balancing for this, so I'm not sure exactly how that would go down. But I think a power along the lines of that would be super cool. If you don't like that idea for a power, I have some other ideas. One of them I had would be to have the killer be able to put leeches on somebody, similar to how you can trap people as the pig. And these leeches would have different debuff status effects for the survivors until they can take them off. Another idea would be that they can maybe spit water out as a ranged attack, or maybe even water bend. Would be a little silly, of course, but just something along the lines of that would be pretty cool to see in the game, I think. And yeah, that's basically it for all my ideas for original chapters in Dead by Daylight. If I have any more, I'll probably make a part 2 to this, but at the moment, this is all I can think of. If you guys have any ideas for original characters you'd like to see added in Dead by Daylight, I would like to know in the comments. And yeah, a like and subscribe would be super helpful, and as always, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and stay safe in the fog, everybody.